Hi, my name is Phil Metzger, and in 1992 I moved to Moscow, Russia. From there I lived in the beautiful Central European country of Hungary, where my family and I spent the next 20 years living, learning, and sharing about Jesus. Different foods, culture, and language, but underneath it all, we discovered the most amazing people. We learned that to share the gospel effectively, we had to adjust. We had to cross cultures. Now we're back in the U.S., and we're discovering that this country is a melting pot of culture. This show is committed to helping Christians connect to those who think, believe, and live differently than them. This is Crossing Cultures. Welcome back to part 2 of this great conversation that I'm getting to have with Dr. Brian Howell. Brian is a professor of cultural anthropology at Wheaton College in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm just so enjoying this time, and I'm grateful that he's willing to do this. So let's just jump right back into this conversation. You talk about something in the book, and I want to talk about it here a bit. Again, I'm starting to sound like a book review, but I'm not meaning to. It's more just to launch into these ideas. You guys write about how Christianity, there's no Christian culture. And I think that's a really important distinction today, because on one hand, I've heard terms like that we need to be aware of cultural Christianity, and that I think that means one thing to some people. When I first heard the term, I didn't know what they meant by that, and maybe I still don't totally. But then you guys describe the idea of that Christianity, that there is no Christian culture. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So even the term Christianity, you put the ity on there, and you're talking about a manifestation of people following the gospel, people following Christ, right? And anytime you have a manifestation, it has to be done in specific terms. It has to be in a language, in a moment, in a place, in a family, in a community, and it's cultural. It is impossible. There is no way to express our following of Jesus in cultural terms. We just can't do it. There's always specificity to it. So we can't think of Christianity as being more or less cultural, or being somehow, just a Christian, not a certain kind of Christian. We're always a certain kind of Christian. And that shouldn't trouble us. That shouldn't bother us. I point out to students that, the Tower of Babel was a moment when human beings were trying to, ascend to godlike status, and trying to, we were being disobedient. And so God says, okay, people, y'all are going to be obedient. And in the we call it the curse of Babel, but it wasn't really a curse. It was more just it was a starter. It was like, you're supposed to spread out over the earth, and you're supposed to develop all of these different cultural manifestations. And so here you go. You've got to do that now. I'm going to give you these languages, and off you go. And then, of course, the reverse of that, or the glimpse of the restoration of humanity, was at Pentecost. Here's all the people assembled before the disciples, but the miracle of Pentecost was not that everybody spoke the same language. Exactly. The miracle was they heard it in their own languages, right? So here was God saying, I am blessing this cultural diversity. I'm blessing this linguistic diversity. That is meant to be, and my gospel will go out in these myriad languages that exist in the world, and they're not going to go away. And then we get to the vision of heaven, and there they still are, right? So this idea that we should be just Christian, and I hear this when I don't want to call myself an American Christian. I don't want to call myself, people call themselves a Black Christian or an Asian Christian, but they're not. They're just Christian. And it's like, no, they are. Exactly. We are certain kinds of Christians, but that's good. Don't think that is somehow compromising the message. It's just the challenge of saying, okay, what does faithfulness look like in this context for me? And of course, it's going to involve embracing some of the things that help me to be faithful that come from my culture, and rejecting or transforming, or in other ways resisting those things that are in my context that make it more difficult to be a faithful Christian.
And that's where it's so hard. And I'm curious your thoughts on this, because it's like somebody can say, yeah, I don't want to identify as this kind of a Christian or that kind of a Christian or whatever. We're just Christian. But it's like, but you said that in English, first of all. And most of the world doesn't even speak that language. And I'm just making something up, you're also a male, which puts you at a power dynamic that most of the world will not be able to connect. And you're wealthier than most of the world because you are also born into the United States. I mean, there's all these And just because I'm ignorant of those things doesn't make them not true. And that seems to be like a real dilemma today of like, just because I don't know that that there's different ways that, I think I'm coming across a certain way, that doesn't mean that that's how it actually is. The only way I discover that is through the conversation, is through the genuine openness. And it takes a lot to get to where people will be honest. I mean, here you are. I mean, I'll just use your own as an example. I'm sure it takes time for students to be willing to open up parts of themselves in a classroom context, or even to you. They have to feel like they can be, there's trust. I think that if I share this, they're going to understand what I'm saying. And I think that we just miss that so much when we victimize ourselves in this cultural conversation. Like, well, but it's just for, again, like to your point, without making some political statement, there's a Black Lives Matter, an All Lives Matter. And so we want to remove people from their cultural identity, but we don't know what that means to them. We only see it as a victim. I see myself as a victim.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's threatening because this is where we are so shaped and so connected to our cultural context. Right. And so as we feel like those things are sometimes even just being pointed out, I think becomes a bit of a threat to those people who are not used to thinking of themselves as being a specific kind of person. They think of themselves as normal. And I talk about this in the book is, that there's this tendency for especially somebody who has grown up in a context where they haven't been very much challenged or difference has always seemed, to be the exception. And most people are like them. Then they grow up sort of thinking, well, this is normal people. And then there are different people. Mm-hmm. And different people need to be kind of explained. And maybe even, they like different people. I've heard students say, I've heard sort of white US American students say, I'm so envious of my Asian friends who have a culture because I don't really have a culture. I'm just normal and I'm just boring, And they're thinking of this as a kind of like lack of themselves. But I say, but the problem is it sort of sets you up like, if nothing happened to a human being, they would end up just like you. And it's only when some weird thing happens that they end up speaking Chinese or, eating rice every day or something. And it's like, we have to let go of that. We have to make sure that but then I do find students saying, oh, so I do have a culture. And it forms something in them where they realize, oh, okay, there's something sort of special and unique about me. There is something sort of interesting about me. And I can begin to reflect on that and think about that. And sometimes there's a little bit of lamenting of the ways in which our broken world has, made it hard for us to connect with other people or exalted certain cultural forms over others. And people get sort of like, well, they feel sad about it. And then often they sort of feel, they sort of interpret that as guilt. And I can't feel guilty about just being born the way I am. And I agree with them. Don't feel guilty, but understand who you are, and then learn to love the things and learn to understand that God has made you a certain way and that you have a gift to bring to the kingdom that is part of who you are and part of your cultural heritage, and that's a good thing, but it should never be at the expense of anybody else. We have to make sure that it's not rooted in historic hierarchies. And there are ways in which we now have opportunities to bring redemption that are from our cultural context, even if it's from some of the brokenness that's been part of the past.
And it seems, it's a hard thing to accept when you decide to say, I'm just, because understanding seems like to many like a tacit, I'm wrong. I must be wrong. Where it's like, well, hold on, maybe you are. I mean, the Bible already says we are, so let's start there. But nobody's asking you to, that always becomes the question, well, if I start accepting, if I understand and listen to these things, what's the end of this? Where does this end? And I always laugh, and I was just thinking about what you said about how my culture is, I'm outside of it and they all got these other things. I love when people will say, I don't have an accent. I wish I had an accent. I wish, it's that same idea of like, well, you kind of do. It's just that you're not aware of it. And so much of what we have in us, we're just not aware of. We're not aware of the things that shaped us, the people necessarily, the history that we learned that shaped us. It's not about all things are wrong or it's all right, but we just have to be aware of the fact that it did shape us. It's shaping who we are. you're hitting on the point of, just the idea of ethnocentrism, and it's something that we talked about in our earlier shows on race. But you guys talk about this idea of tacit ethnocentrism. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, just this idea of normalcy, of that if sort of left alone, human beings would pretty much end up like Midwestern Americans, this is sort of the trajectory of humanity in some way. Now, I know that, very few people, if anybody, would actually put it that way, but you often, as I said, people will say something like, it's so interesting that Europeans don't put ice in their water. How weird is that? It's so unusual. But you think about that, like all the technology and the work that has to go into creating ice, so that we can stick it in our glasses, when that's odd, like how we've gotten used to that and how we think of that as refreshing and or nature. I've had many African-American students tell me they find camping to be just a really funny thing. It's a very white people thing, they would say. This like, why do I need to go out and pretend to be homeless for 3 weeks? Like, how is that fun? Why do you do this? But and it can be funny just to sort of acknowledge, like, yeah, that's a quirky thing. But oftentimes they feel pressure from white students who are like, no, you just don't get it. You don't understand. Like, it's somehow objectively fun to go camping. It's somehow objectively good for your soul. It's a place where you meet God. It's a place where you grow spiritually. And some of the Black students feel like, why are you telling me that I'm deficient? How am I deficient? Because I don't see camping as this spiritual experience. And that can be really frustrating for people who feel like, oh, now you're not just saying, this is a sort of interesting thing about my culture. You're saying, no, this is how it should be. And you need to learn to love this. And the Black students would be like, are you going to come and learn how fantastic my neighborhood is? No, you're going to come to my neighborhood and tell me it's scary, and tell me you feel uncomfortable, and tell me that it's, you don't like standing out and that you might get mugged or whatever. And that's where this tacit ethnocentrism, these kids who love camping, they're not racist. They're not bad kids. They're not ones who think that their culture is the best, but they've never identified the ways in which their love of camping is something that they've learned in a cultural context.
I'm curious too, like when you say that, like what are the areas today or that you see here in the North American context? What are the cultural issues that you see that we as Christians need to learn to understand or to be open to? And again, I use the word open, not in the compromise, but in the like, I need to not be so defensive and be willing to hear where somebody's coming from, even just to the point that you just made. It's like an African-American student, and it might say, I don't see camping as an objective goal to making me like that. I'm missing something in my life. That just requires a little bit of understanding from another student's perspective. What are the cultural issues today that you're saying? I mean, there's the hot topic, the hot button ones that we see today. We can talk about race, which we have briefly. Gender issues are obviously a really hot topic. The subject of the abortion is most of these fall within the realm of our political world, though, right now. We've been told from a political perspective to be angry and up in arms about these, and we vote this way and we think this way, and it's unchristian to think any other way. What are the more subtle or other areas that you see as somebody who studies culture and the social sciences? Are there any that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I know that a lot of Christians really desire that we would, be more unified as a church. And this, I'm thinking particularly of the white church, the majority white church, majority Black church, but also churches that are majority Asian or that speak other languages, the Spanish-speaking church, that I think there's a lot of interest in coming together and being more unified in how we represent the gospel, in how we serve and as salt and light in the world. But I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding of how deep the cultural differences can be and how deeply those are felt. How much many Christians from the Black church, from majority Asian churches feel that they are giving up when they enter into a majority white church. And the majority white church would invariably say, we want to be welcoming and hospitable, and we and they'll sing a song in Spanish or something, but they won't look at the sort of structures of leadership, the ways in which qualifications are adjudicated, the ways in which men and women find roles in the church, elders and youth find roles in the church, the kinds of affirmations that people receive in very informal ways that can make a space seem really inhospitable, or make somebody feel like a permanent guest, right? Which nobody wants to feel like in their own church. Right. And I think for the church to really begin to grasp, and class differences, right? Like in some ways it can be easier to bring together, Black and white Christians who all are college educated and professional than it is to bring together an all white church that has blue collar working class people and college educated professional types. Like those differences are really significant. And I think we typically don't grapple with them because, again, the sort of tacit ethnocentrism says, well, of course you have to have a pastor with an MDiv. Well, of course you dress in these ways. It's natural to have these kinds of carpeting and decor and colors, and this looks nice and that doesn't look nice. And it just seems so sort of normal to us that then we don't have the ability to interrogate and say, but why? Why have we chosen this, whatever, this light blue carpeting and think that it's really, this Pottery Barn look and think that it's really lovely? Like, where does that come from? And why do we think that that's important? And how might that be affecting the ways in which we're actually able to bring people in and form a community here? So until I think we get a little more, just a little more sophisticated in our understanding of how much culture affects us, we keep sort of tweaking at the margins, and then we say, well, why didn't it work? Exactly. We tried really hard. We have really good hearts. We really welcomed them, and they didn't come.
So we want the feeling of you're welcome to be enough, even though we're not making any real adjustments or real change. And I love what you said there, because it is true. It's like we want to add a song in the language, thinking that language is the only, if language was met, then we would be solving the problems. But what we don't understand is that the issue of culture is far deeper than just a linguistic issue. Certainly language has a big part to play in that, but this feeling of and again, the majority never sees that. It doesn't matter what color or language the majority is, there's always a majority. The majority doesn't often see that everybody else makes adjustments to the majority. And it's a powerful thing when the majority decides we're going to make adjustments for everybody else. It's not the loss of identity, it's the inclusion of additional identities. And that's what heaven is. That's how the Bible describes heaven. And yet, boy, I wonder how difficult it is to do today, especially my struggle is here in America to see this happen. I'm in a predominantly Hispanic area. Our church is Hispanic and Filipino, Black, and then I call Navy its own group, white. What does it look? And then I would say the church becomes its own culture. It doesn't represent necessarily one color culture, but it certainly represents its own kind of I would use that phrase, Christian culture. But there is no Christian culture, and it's a majority that just kind of creates this idea. I found that in Eastern Europe, it was easier to bring in multiple cultural experiences into the church than I have here. And I think part of that is just my own understanding, trying to grow, trying to learn, trying to understand. But the process of understanding puts me at odds with many who believe that that's liberal because you're open, and fighting those kinds of battles and all. But do you see churches today that are really excelling in this?
I had an experience in St. Louis where I went to graduate school of a church that was a PCA church, so not a liberal church. And they put themselves deliberately in a community that was right on the border between the county, which is the majority white area, and the city, which is majority Black. And they really were trying to bring these two groups together in a city that was extremely segregated and extremely divided. It was a slave state and all the legacies of that are there. And they, not a perfect church, but they did some things that were really powerful, where the pastor, whether they had a preaching team, they had a head pastor, but then they had a board of elders, and they would often have one of their Black elders who didn't have a MDiv, even though there were several elders who had PhDs and who had, advanced training and all these, but they would make sure the Black elder got to preach a lot. And having him up there and preaching in a way that was very indicative of the Black style. But even when the white head pastor would preach, he would say things that would bring together Black and white communities in such a way that it was clear that there was not one normal experience. You know, when he would talk about the need for the gospel to cover sins, he would say, you know, the sins of the Wall Street lawyer, the sins of the crack addict, the sins of the gangbanger, the sins of the gossipy suburban parent, you know, and he would put all these into one basket. And then when we would do worship together, we would sing a song, you know, we would sing a traditional kind of a European hymn, and then we would sing a gospel song, and then we would sing a song in Spanish, and then we would sing a song from like 60s res band, you know, rock, weird, whatever, Jesus people. And it was very weird and very disjointed. It wasn't this kind of smooth service that had a, you know, rhythm to it. But when you talk to people about it, what you realized is that everybody felt like they were giving up something for the sake of the community. Nobody felt like they were getting everything they wanted. But the leadership said that's kind of the point. Like, we're not here to get what we want. We are here to give what we can and to worship in a way that, so like when I'm standing there and I don't know how to worship in this song and it's nothing I've ever heard before, but I can see my Black sister just weeping and crying out. It's like my discomfort is kind of the gift that I can give to her in that moment. And then when we sing this, you know, hymn that comes from my childhood that means a lot to me, and she's like, why are we singing funeral dirges? I don't really understand how this is worshipful. But she also understands that like white people need that, you know, like this white guy needs this hymn. And so for these 3.5 minutes or whatever, I'm going to worship in this kind of odd way so that he can have this experience. And I think that sort of creates this sense of like, we are all weirdos here.
Yeah.
We all have our own thing that we're bringing in, but none of us should be expecting that it's all good for us.
Wow.
You know,
That is powerful, because it's like, now I go to church knowing I will be giving up. That's my act of worship, even, that I'm going to give up some of my comfort, some of my norms as a way of blessing other people. When I think you're hitting on a chord here of, and this is a human nature. It's not America. This is a human nature issue of, I don't want to give up. I want to get. I want, you know, that's not an American issue. It's we've seen it all over the world. I'm here for me. I'm here to, hey, I need God. I need to be this. I need to. What a different way of thinking about my Christianity when I'm like, I go to church, or I exist not just for what I get, but for what I'm willing to give up. And, you know, that's a big part of, and I talk a lot about this. 1 Corinthians 9 is all about, what am I willing to give up for the sake of the gospel? You know, what cultural, you know, what, like, that's my norm. I'm comfortable with that, and I'm not comfortable with this, or whatever it might be. I'm so encouraged to hear that, and the way that you express that is powerful. Thanks for sharing that. That was like, ooh, hello. Sheesh.
I mean, it's hard because people go to church and they have this sort of ineffable idea of like, I want to feel comfortable. That's how I'll grow as a Christian. But if you think, what makes you comfortable? Your culture makes you comfortable.
Right, exactly.
That is what makes you comfortable.
Exactly.
So in fact, some discomfort, if people want to say, as a Christian, I should be resisting culture, pick a church that makes you uncomfortable. Like, that's actually going to help you more than just finding a church where you feel like, oh, I totally get this place.
Wow. Because the Bible makes none of us comfortable. If we're reading the Bible correctly, it's infuriating. And I mean that because I'm a sinner. God is holy. He's speaking things to my life that are offensive to my nature. And so, I love that idea of like, the need to be uncomfortable. That's powerful, because we fight against that with everything we have.
Oh yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. And in fact, we blame other people, you know, like people leave churches because the pastor made them uncomfortable, because this song made them uncomfortable, because those people and the way they raise their kids makes them uncomfortable. It's pretty common. It's pretty widespread.
You know what? It's interesting. That to me, that's been a very much an American experience for me. And here's why. Where I was in Hungary, most of the time, we were the only church that they could go to. It wasn't like they had a million options. So it's like, if they didn't like something, they're like, well, What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? You know, we don't and so I kind of benefited from the fact that people didn't have options. I hate to say that, but we're coming here. It really has been a shocker to, you know, I'm thinking like, these are minor things we don't agree on. But people have left just because of that. And it's like, wow, this is deep rooted. And I wouldn't have, like, pushback is a part of life, but for many, that pushback is a sign of this is not where I'm supposed to be anymore.
Right. And we spiritualize it and say, oh, God is clearly calling me somewhere else because I felt uncomfortable last week.
I want to finish with one. Keep going.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of examples of churches that are doing this well, you know, this was a church that was very intentional about this. But I think another example, and maybe this will resonate with your experience, are is international churches. When you go to some place like Dubai, or you go to some place, you know, where you know, people from all over the world, Christians from all over the world, are there for work, for study, whatever, and they come to this church, and there may only be one or two churches, and of course, they usually have to pick a language, and it's often English because that's a very widespread language in business and travel and such. But if nobody's super in charge, if it's not like there's a majority of Americans or a majority of British or a majority of you know, Filipinos or whomever, then there's often this like, okay, we got to get everybody in here. And so they'll maybe switch off Sundays where like it's Filipino Sunday and we're going to, you know, or it's, you know, British Episcopalian Sunday or something, you know, and there's something so cool about it that people, they just can't leave. Like they don't have a choice. And so they say, we all have our things that we like, and now we can share them with one another, and we don't have to love them. I don't have to love the way the Nigerians worship, but A, they need their turn because that's a loving way to be a community. And B, I can probably learn something. And there's probably something really important here for me. And who knows, I may actually discover I prefer it or I love it in some way that I didn't even expect.
Or I find something in me that is like, ooh, that ignited something in me I didn't even know was there.
Totally. Yeah. And I think just so many of us never have that chance because we choose churches that are super homogenous and comfortable.
And I think that, you know, even the description that you gave of like, you know, again, an example is a perfect one of Dubai. Everybody that's there recognizes their culture will not be, I mean, in every context, their culture will not dominate. That's just going to be the way it is. Whether I'm Filipino, South Korean, American, Nigerian, Ethiopian, I'm in my business world, I am one of multiple cultures. And I'm expecting that in my church as well, where I think in a lot of countries, you end up kind of falling into your racial line for church, because it's like I can go to work and be in a multi-ethnic environment, but then when I go to my neighborhood where I live, it might not be that way as much. Or it's this third culture of like this its own Christian thing that it's created. And I just love what you're saying about the importance of getting outside of my comfort. I mean, gosh.
And I do think, you know, just as a piece that makes this a little more complicated, a little harder for people is anthropology also brings in this question of power, and the fact that, you know, even when we walk into a church, the world doesn't disappear, and history doesn't disappear, and there still are these relationships that make it more difficult for some people to enter in than others, and make it complicated in those ways. And I saw this in the church in St. Louis, that white folks had to work a little harder. That first of all, they weren't used to giving up their own cultural preferences because they tended to get them everywhere they went. And second of all, that Black folks didn't necessarily trust them because they had so many experiences of being mistreated and finding things, you know, promises broken, and ways in which, you know, they weren't able to understand white culture in a way that allowed them to, and they were just never accepted, right? And then that those preferences for education, for a certain kind of speaking, even some Black folks had been sort of inculcated with those as being superior. You know, I get Black students at Wheaton who will say they were taught that if they were going to get ahead, they need to speak proper. And they were kind of taught to despise the ways that their relatives spoke and the ways that their neighborhood spoke as somehow inferior. And so there's this level of power that if we're not aware of it, we might think, oh, it's just, we're all in partnership here. And we can be, and I think we can strive for that and we can long for that, but we also have to recognize that it's not here yet, that we still live in a broken world where especially in the United States, certain cultural forms and certain racial identities have gotten preference and been thought of as better, for so long, that it's not easy to undo that.
But it requires us, and because I love what you're saying here, it requires us to not just use our own personal experience as the guidepost for this. Because that again, I see that a lot. It's like, well, I've never treated anybody like that. It's like, okay, nobody's saying that you did. It's about recognizing that it exists within the broader history and culture, exactly. And so, because everything becomes like I think we treat culture quite often as, well, but I've never done that, but it's my experience and it's like, okay, that's a part of it. But then I need to be willing to kind of move outside of myself without prejudice, without defensiveness or insecurity. You and I stand at the very apex of the cultural mountain in many ways, historically and even presently. White, male, we have a lot of, and that doesn't mean that you and I personally are the problem. We can't change who we are, right? But just, I love what you said about, like, I have to then be willing to there's adjustments I'm going to have to make that are uncomfortable if I want somebody from another culture to genuinely feel like they've got a part in this relationship or in this, whether it be a church or a friendship or whatever it might be. And that's a big thing that's been very hard for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, it's that tacit ethnocentrism, and it's very deep rooted that we just think our experience makes sense. It does make sense for us in the ways that we have made sense of everything for our whole lives. But we have to recognize we can't see it all. And of course, this shouldn't be hard for Christians to understand. No. We see through a glass darkly. We are limited in our understanding of things. I mean, the noetic effects of sin, that sin has actually infected our very ability to reason. Right. So it shouldn't come as a shock to us that the ways that we perceive the world are not perfect. And not just perfect in the sense of ideal, but perfect in the sense of complete. They're not complete, right? And I know that, now as a 52-year-old person with a PhD in studying culture, I am still learning, and I am still, need my peers who have different cultural experiences, different experiences in the US, around the world. I need them to speak into my life and teach me, because otherwise I'm not going to get it. Reading a book and, watching documentaries is not going to be a replacement for humbly sitting at somebody's feet and listening to them and really allowing their experience to reframe things that I know.
Wow. That's powerful. Golly. I wanted to ask, and it's just kind of, this is terrible though, to open this question and then to be like, but we'll just finish with this. But you guys talk, you wrote about in the book, and I just, something that fascinates me, the idea of gender and culture. And gosh, these are like, I read it all. I think I'm understanding. And then I'm like, wait, I don't really think I get it. Like, I wrote this, like, this is from the book you guys write. It's an oversimplification to assume that gender is cultural and sex is biological, as if people invented gender distinctions and God created sexual differences. Sex and gender are both cultural insofar as humans create categories to organize the diversity of the natural world. And I thought, I just love to hear your thoughts on that area. Because it's so tricky. It's beautiful how you guys wrote that.
So of course God created male and female. That's like right up front in Genesis. And so there's this sexual dimorphism, as we say, that there are these differences. But then, what do they mean? This is the question that's where humans have to do something with these differences. And as we point out in the book, the physical differences between human men and women are not vast in the sense of like, it's not like men are 3 feet taller than women, or, giant, or, you think about like insects where you've got like a giant praying mantis and then the male is this tiny little thing that she eats, it's like, we're not weird like that.
We're not like that. Yeah.
We're pretty similar. But these differences certainly matter. They matter in extraordinary ways in terms of having children, in terms of raising children, in terms of forming families and all of that. But they matter so differently in different places. And they've mattered so differently over time. We absolutely can see how today we think of maleness and femaleness in different ways, in terms of what women are capable of, in terms of what men are capable of, very differently than we did even 100 years ago, to say nothing of, 500 years ago. So this is us making sense of these bodies that we have and how they work and how they're different and how they're similar. And so the biology of our bodies is real, but it doesn't just sort of exist in some neutral way. I mean, obviously you're a man or a woman, even if you don't have children. Like you could say, well, the sexual differences are all about, children. But even if you don't have children, you're still a man or you're still a woman. You can say, well, it's hormones. Well, but hormone levels change over your life. They certainly vary between individuals. There are some women who have really high levels of testosterone and some men who have, low levels or high levels of estrogen, but they're still men and women. And we're still thinking about, what difference does that make? What does that mean for us in our daily lives? And what should it mean for our whole society to call people men and women, and for men and women to do things and to do them together, to do them separately? And this is where I think, the church definitely has something really powerful to say and really important to say about the dignity of both maleness and femaleness, about the importance of maleness and femaleness. But I also think the church has sometimes gotten stuck on very specific manifestations of maleness and femaleness and said, oh, this is the only way to be a male. This is the only way to be a female. Or here's what, being a woman means forever, all time, since Eve into heaven.
Can you give examples of that? That's powerful. I think it resonates.
Some of these books that would say every man wants three things, and every woman wants these three things. And they're always two different lists, right? So there's no woman who wants any of these three things, and there's no man who wants any of these three things. And so if you have a male body and you look at that other list and you say, but I do want one of those things.
Right. Then something's wrong with you.
Something's wrong with me. And I actually think that there are people who leave the church because they feel like the church is telling them, if I don't fit into a very specific way of being a man or a woman, then I can't love God, or God doesn't love me. And I think that this is really, first of all, I just think historically we've changed a ton. Why have we suddenly picked a new historical moment and said, no, that's the one that actually should be timeless? But also I think we're thinking of these as reified categories, as specific things that exist, rather than things that we are always culturally making sense of. We are always culturally. Now, I recognize that some people could hear this and say, oh my gosh, he's saying gender is just a complete fabrication, or that, gender fluidity is biblical or something like that. I want to avoid a lot of the sort of political language around this, because I think we need a biblical language around this. But I also think we have imposed a lot of cultural language from the 50s of the United States, or from the 19th century or something, onto the Bible. So both of those is dangerous. It's both dangerous to bring all the contemporary LGBTQAI plus language onto scripture. It's also dangerous to bring Victorian sexuality onto the Bible. The Bible is neither of those things. And the Bible isn't even one thing when you look at sexuality, right? Or when you look at gender. You've got women who fight as warriors and who lead. You've got, men who are tender fathers, tender parents, who care for their children. You've got all kinds of examples of ways in which gender mattered differently at different points in scripture.
Right, totally. You think of Paul, as a nursing mother, he uses that analogy. It's like, wait, what guy today would use that as an analogy to define care for a group of people? Probably nobody would do that today. It doesn't fit within the construct of our idea of what it means to be a man. And so you're right, that's so powerful. I had an experience when I was in Ethiopia, where they have a very different idea of what is masculinity. Also, they have a very, very, very narrow idea of what homosexuality is, what it means to be gay. It's very, very, very different. And I remember walking with this guy, and I have a picture that somebody took. I took an outreach team there from the college I was at, and we're there, and we went to this church. It was beautiful, and everything you just described earlier, different kinds of worship, different sounds, everything was different, and we just loved it. But we were there for that, afterwards we had this big old coffee experience, and the pastor was probably 6'4", big old, just manly, what we would call like this manly guy. And him and I are walking down the road, and we had just really hit it off. And he looked at me, and he looked down at me because he was quite a bit taller, and he said, with his great accent, he said, "Pastor Phil, I love you." And he proceeded to take my hand and interlock his hand in my hand. And we walked down the street with our with our hands locked. And I thought, oh my goodness, if only everybody in Europe could see me right now. This is the opposite of masculinity. And yet here's this most manly, wonderful, godly man. And he just had a different idea of what it means. And so I think that, like, I love what you're saying about this, and I love, and I don't want to take too much more of your time because it's valuable and it's been great. You've given so much food for thought. But I love that even within gender, you're helping us to see, like, it's not about rethinking. It's just about shedding, like, is it possible that I've added cultural language to a biblical? Because we do kind of have a very clear idea of what God says about, male, female from the Bible, but yet we definitely have put too much of our Victorian or whatever it might be, European backgrounds or whatever cultural, we tend to identify ourselves in masculinity and femininity in those terms. So,
and we won't escape it. It's not that we can read the Bible in some non-cultural way, but I definitely think as we learn from other people who are reading the Bible through other cultural lenses, we will begin to see, oh yeah, this is the ways in which I have interpreted these things in pretty specific ways. And there's alternatives here, alternatives that do not violate the text of Scripture, that are not contradicting what the Bible says, but actually open it up and allow, again, sort of open me to the Holy Spirit and what I could learn that I just wasn't learning from my one cultural vantage point.
Wow. That's powerful. We've covered a million different topics in such a short time, but amazing. I mean, thank you so much for being willing to do this. Seriously.
Pleasure. And I think the work you're doing is so important. I mean, it's what I feel my vocation is. My vocation, I feel called to kind of bring some of the insights of anthropology to the church because I think we could really use them and they're really important. But you're doing it. You're getting it out there. So I really appreciate you inviting me on and giving me this chance to talk about it.
Oh my gosh. It was like, I think it's going to be so helpful to so many people. And I know it was for me. And like I said, it wasn't meant to be a book review, but I loved it. And I spent so much time rethinking ideas like, gosh, I wish I would have known that before, or wow, it was just so enlightening. And I'm super thankful for not only the book, but the time that you took. So thanks for doing this, Brian.
Great blessing. I really appreciate it.